Welcome back to the channel. If you're here late at night looking for a story to drift off to, you're in the right place. Before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe.
Ava Marie Hollis was born on August 12, 2011, in Lancaster County, Ohio. She arrived on a humid summer afternoon, the youngest of 4 girls. Her sisters, Lauren, Brianna, and Kaylee, were already teenagers by the time she was born, and from the start, they treated her less like a sibling and more like a tiny celebrity who had unexpectedly joined the family. Ava had bright blue eyes and sandy brown hair that usually fell past her shoulders in soft waves. In early childhood photos, she often wore it long and loose, but just before her 12th birthday, she asked for something bold. She walked out of the salon with one side cropped short and the other left chin length, grinning as if she had just reinvented herself. Because she was born in August during the county fair, she grew up believing the fireworks on closing night were partly for her. Lauren liked to tease that Ava used to wave at the sky as the colors burst overhead, convinced the entire town had gathered to celebrate her birthday. Ava had that kind of personality, open, joyful, ready to claim the world as something friendly and meant for her. Her sister Kaylee often described her as a sunbeam kid. Even when she was little, Ava wanted to be wherever the action was. If her older sisters were baking cookies, she pulled a chair to the counter and insisted on stirring. If they were watching an old black and white movie, she curled up beside them and asked questions about actors who had died decades before she was born. She loved classic films, musicals especially. At 9 years old, she could sing entire songs from movies released long before her parents had met. In school, Ava thrived. Teachers described her as focused and curious. She read above grade level and seemed to have a natural sense for storytelling. When she graduated from elementary school, she wore a maroon gown that nearly swallowed her small frame. The sleeves covered her hands completely, but she stood straight, smiling with quiet pride. Blue was her favorite color, so she wore bright blue sneakers under the robe, a secret splash of personality only visible when she walked. Family videos from those years show a girl who laughed easily. In one clip, she played a whipped cream party game with her sisters. When the cream splattered across her face, she jumped in surprise, then dissolved into giggles. Instead of crying or complaining, she wiped some onto her finger, tasted it, and declared it worth it. That was Ava in a nutshell, able to turn embarrassment into humor, disappointment into something sweet. Her father, Thomas Hollis, had raised his 3 older daughters after divorcing their mother when Kaylee was 5. The girls described him as strict but steady. He believed in discipline and structure. When they were younger, he used corporal punishment, something they did not always agree with, but said never crossed into cruelty during their childhoods. He had struggled with prescription medication misuse years earlier, but by the time Ava was born, his older daughters believed he had moved past it. Ava's mother's name was kept mostly private by the family. She and Thomas separated when Ava was still young, and at first Ava lived primarily with her mother. For several years, her life remained relatively stable. She saw her father regularly and maintained close relationships with her sisters, who were now adults building lives of their own. Then, when Ava was about 6, her mother was diagnosed with a progressive neurological illness. At first, the symptoms were subtle: fatigue, weakness, trouble walking long distances. Within a few years, the disease advanced rapidly. She required mobility aids, then in-home care. Eventually, she had to move into a long-term care facility because she could no longer manage daily tasks on her own. It was a devastating shift for Ava, who loved visiting her mother and bringing drawings to tape on the wall beside her bed. With her mother unable to care for her, Ava moved in full-time with her father in 2018. For a while, things seemed manageable. Kaylee even lived with them for a period, helping with homework and driving Ava to activities. Ava continued to do well academically and joined the school choir. She still adored movies, still loved bright blue everything, still begged her sisters to take her to the fair. Around 2019, Thomas began dating a woman named Rebecca Shaw. Rebecca had a young son, about 4 years younger than Ava. To outsiders, she appeared attentive and organized. Her social media profiles showed carefully staged photos, tidy kitchens, inspirational quotes, selfies with filtered lighting. But Rebecca had a complicated past. In the late 1990s, Rebecca had been involved in a relationship that ended in tragedy. She and a former partner had been investigated after a toddler in their care died from a head injury. The death was ruled a homicide, but prosecutors at the time said they could not determine which adult was responsible. Charges were filed against her partner, who was eventually convicted years later on related evidence uncovered in a separate abuse case. Rebecca herself accepted a plea agreement on lesser charges connected to child endangerment involving another child in the home. She served several years in prison before being released. After her release, Rebecca had additional children, some of whom were temporarily removed by Child Protective Services before being reunified. By the time she met Thomas, her youngest son was Ava's father, then a group with 2 young daughters. The relationship between Thomas and Ava's older sisters began to strain. In 2020, Thomas was granted primary custody of Ava. The custody agreement included a clause that Ava was not to be left alone with Rebecca for extended periods without written agreement from both parents. Given Rebecca's background, the condition seemed prudent, but as the relationship between Thomas and Rebecca deepened, lines began to blur. By late 2021, Thomas posted romantic messages online declaring that he had found someone who loved him unconditionally. Rebecca appeared frequently in photos, smiling beside him at cookouts and local festivals. Ava appeared in some pictures too, usually standing slightly apart, smiling politely. At her annual checkup in November 2021, Ava was described as healthy and within a normal weight range for her age. She was active in school and had no significant medical concerns. In 2022, Thomas and Rebecca moved with the children to a rural property outside Millfield, Ohio, farther from Ava's sisters and extended family. The home sat at the end of a long gravel drive surrounded by trees. Around that time, Thomas took Ava to visit her mother for what would become their final in-person meeting. Ava started middle school that fall. Teachers initially described her as engaged and capable, but small changes began to surface. She occasionally appeared tired. Once or twice she had minor bruises, explained away as clumsiness or sports. Over the next months, Thomas's online presence continued to paint a cheerful picture. Holiday decorations, family ornaments with their names engraved, photos of baking cookies. Ava stood in those photos, smiling with closed lips. Her hair looked thinner. Sometimes she wore oversized sweatshirts. Privately, her sisters struggled with distance. Invitations to visit were often declined due to scheduling conflicts. Camping trips, work obligations, last-minute plans. Kaylee once arranged to attend a chili cook-off where Thomas was competing, hoping to see Ava. She did see her briefly later that evening in a hotel room. The room felt unusually cold. Ava remained wrapped in a thick blanket, chatting about school and movies, offering no sign of distress. When Thomas and Rebecca returned, the visit ended quickly. In early 2023, Ava began missing more school days. Some were excused, others not. Staff made reports to Child Protective Services expressing concern about attendance and visible changes in her appearance. A caseworker called the home but did not complete a visit. Soon after, Ava was withdrawn from in-person classes and enrolled in online schooling. Rebecca's son continued attending school outside the home. Ava did not. Neighbors saw little of the family. Social media posts continued, photos of vacations, romantic captions, meals prepared on the grill. But Ava's presence in these images became less frequent. In spring 2023, extended family felt something was wrong, though none could articulate exactly what. Phone calls were unanswered, text messages were brief. Kaylee sent birthday gifts and holiday cards, unsure if they ever reached her sister. On May 4th, 2023, emergency responders were called to the family's rural home. Ava was transported to a local hospital in critical condition. Despite extensive efforts by medical staff, she died that evening. What investigators uncovered in the weeks that followed would shock the community and fracture the Hollis family beyond repair. But at the center of it all remained the memory of a girl who once believed fireworks were lit just for her, who loved blue sneakers and old musicals, and who laughed when whipped cream splattered across her nose. In the days after Ava's death, the quiet rural road outside the house filled with vehicles. Sheriff's deputies blocked the gravel driveway. Neighbors stood in clusters at the edge of their lawns, speaking in hushed tones. News crews arrived before the sun had fully risen the next morning. What had first been described as a medical emergency was quickly reclassified as a criminal investigation. At the hospital, physicians who had worked on Ava notified authorities almost immediately. They had seen injuries that did not align with a sudden illness or accident. She was severely underweight. Bruising covered multiple areas of her body in various stages of healing. There were signs of prolonged neglect. The medical team documented everything carefully, understanding that their notes would likely become evidence. The sheriff's office secured the house. Inside, investigators began a systematic search. The rural property, which had appeared unremarkable from the outside, revealed a far more troubling interior. According to later court testimony, certain rooms were orderly and staged, particularly common areas where guests might be received. Other spaces told a different story. Ava's bedroom was sparse. There were limited personal items. Clothing and drawers appeared ill-fitting for her age and size. Investigators noted a lack of typical preteen belongings, no recent school projects displayed, few books within reach, and minimal signs of active hobbies. A laptop used for online schooling was collected for forensic analysis. More alarming were indications that Ava's movement inside the home had been restricted. Evidence suggested she had been isolated from the rest of the household for extended periods. Locks and monitoring measures were documented. Food storage areas were examined. Investigators compared the quantity and accessibility of food available in the kitchen with Ava's physical condition. Thomas and Rebecca were interviewed separately within 24 hours. At first, both maintained that Ava had been struggling with behavioral issues. They described her as defiant, prone to sneaking food, and resistant to authority. They claimed they were attempting to impose structure and discipline. Thomas insisted that any physical marks were the result of reasonable parental correction. Rebecca echoed his statements, framing their actions as necessary responses to escalating misconduct. As detectives pressed for specifics, inconsistencies began to surface. Timelines did not align. Explanations shifted. When asked about Ava's significant weight loss over the previous year, Thomas attributed it to picky eating and anxiety. Rebecca suggested that Ava sometimes refused meals voluntarily. Medical records contradicted these narratives. At her last documented well-child visit in late 2021, Ava had been within a healthy range for her age. The deterioration had occurred over months, not years. Digital evidence added another layer. Forensic analysis of phones and computers revealed internet searches related to child discipline techniques, food deprivation, and methods of concealment. Investigators also recovered text messages between Thomas and Rebecca discussing Ava's behavior in harsh, dehumanizing terms. In some exchanges, they referred to her as manipulative or deceitful, language that suggested a dynamic far more punitive than corrective. School records showed a clear pattern. During her final months in public school, teachers had documented visible changes. She appeared fatigued. Her clothing hung loosely on her frame. She often kept her arms folded across her torso.
Staff had reported concerns to Child Protective Services, citing unexplained bruising and rapid weight loss. A caseworker had attempted phone contact but had not completed an in-home assessment before Ava was withdrawn and placed in online schooling. That transition became a focal point. Investigators learned that Ava's removal from in-person classes occurred shortly after school staff escalated their concerns. Once enrolled in virtual education, her interaction with mandated reporters became limited. Attendance logs showed frequent absences from live sessions. On some days, assignments were submitted without Ava appearing on camera. Meanwhile, Rebecca's son continued attending school physically. Teachers there reported no comparable issues. He appeared adequately nourished and generally well cared for. The contrast between the two children in the same household raised immediate red flags. Autopsy findings were definitive. The medical examiner concluded that Ava's death resulted from a combination of blunt force injuries and chronic malnutrition. The pattern of trauma indicated repeated harm over time rather than a single incident. The manner of death was ruled a homicide. Within 2 weeks, both Thomas Hollis and Rebecca Shaw were arrested and charged. Prosecutors filed counts that included murder, felonious assault, and endangering children. At a press conference, the county prosecutor described the case as one involving prolonged abuse, culminating in fatal injury. He emphasized that the investigation was ongoing and that additional charges could follow as evidence was processed. For Ava's sisters, the arrests brought a complex mix of grief and validation. Lauren later said that seeing the mugshots confirmed what she had feared for years but never fully proven. Kaylee struggled with guilt, replaying memories of brief visits and polite conversations, wondering whether she had missed signs she should have recognized. The community response was immediate. A memorial grew outside Ava's former school. Blue ribbons were tied around fence posts in her honor. Classmates left handwritten notes describing her as kind, funny, and talented. One teacher wrote that Ava had once submitted an essay about wanting to become a filmmaker because she loved stories that made people feel less alone. As the case moved toward trial, pre-trial hearings revealed additional details. Prosecutors presented evidence that Ava had been subjected to escalating punishment. Restrictions on food were allegedly used as discipline. Physical force had been applied repeatedly. There were indications that she had been isolated for extended periods, separated from normal family interaction. The defense argued that Thomas had been attempting to manage severe behavioral challenges and that Rebecca had limited involvement in disciplinary decisions. They suggested that the fatal injuries may have resulted from a single incident that escalated unintentionally. They also questioned whether prior medical conditions could have contributed to her physical decline. However, expert testimony undermined those claims. Physicians stated clearly that the level of malnutrition observed could not have occurred without sustained deprivation. Child Protective Services records became another focal point. Internal reviews examined whether earlier intervention might have altered the outcome. Reports from school staff had been screened but not escalated to immediate home visits. Resource constraints and procedural thresholds were cited as contributing factors. Public criticism intensified, with community members questioning how visible warning signs had not triggered stronger action. Throughout this period, Ava's mother remained in long-term care, physically unable to attend court proceedings. Her sisters coordinated visits to update her in person, struggling to explain developments in a way that would not overwhelm her fragile health. Family members described those conversations as some of the hardest moments of their lives. By late summer, prosecutors signaled that they intended to pursue the most serious charges available under state law. Plea negotiations were discussed but did not initially result in agreement. Both defendants maintained not guilty pleas during early hearings. Media coverage continued steadily. Each court date drew local reporters and national attention. The narrative shifted from shock to systemic reflection.
Commentators debated the challenges of balancing parental rights with child safety. Advocates for stronger oversight in homeschooling arrangements pointed to the case as evidence of gaps in monitoring. For the Hollis family, the legal process moved slowly compared to the immediacy of their loss. Birthdays and holidays arrived without Ava. The county fair held its annual fireworks display that August. Lauren later said she watched the sky and thought about how her little sister used to believe the lights were meant just for her. By the time the case moved toward resolution, more than a year had passed since Ava's death. The house on the gravel road sat empty, its windows dark, the yard slowly overtaken by weeds. What had once been the center of a family's daily life became a physical reminder of failure, silence, and missed opportunities. Pre-trial proceedings stretched across months. Motions were filed, challenging evidence, questioning investigative procedures, and disputing expert conclusions. Prosecutors methodically built their case around three pillars: medical findings, digital communications, and documented patterns of isolation and deprivation. The medical examiner's conclusions remained central. Ava had not died from a sudden accident. Her body showed clear evidence of prolonged malnutrition and repeated blunt force trauma. The timeline indicated escalating harm over an extended period. Digital evidence reinforced intent. Text exchanges between Thomas and Rebecca revealed a shared narrative that portrayed Ava as manipulative and dishonest. In several messages, they discussed restricting her food as a behavioral strategy. There were references to locking doors, monitoring movement, and enforcing isolation as punishment. While the defense argued that frustration in venting in private messages did not equate to criminal intent, prosecutors framed the communications as insight into a sustained pattern of deliberate control. Faced with the weight of the evidence, negotiations intensified. Ultimately, the case did not proceed to a full jury trial. In a negotiated agreement, both defendants entered pleas that acknowledged their roles in the events leading to Ava's death. Thomas accepted responsibility for causing fatal injury. Rebecca admitted to participating in abuse and failing to intervene. The exact legal classifications reflected state statutes, but the practical result was clear. Both would serve substantial prison sentences measured in decades. In court, the judge addressed them directly before imposing sentence. He spoke about the vulnerability of children and the absolute duty of care owed by adults entrusted with their well-being. He emphasized that discipline cannot become cruelty and that control cannot justify deprivation. The courtroom was silent except for the shuffle of paper and the faint hum of ventilation. Ava's sisters were present for sentencing. Lauren read a victim impact statement. She did not raise her voice. She described the little girl who believed fireworks were for her, who loved bright blue shoes and old musicals, who once insisted on reenacting scenes from classic films in the living room. She spoke about the slow erosion of contact, the unanswered calls, the growing unease that she now understood had been warranted. She said the hardest part was knowing that Ava likely felt alone in her final months. Kaylee followed. She admitted to questioning herself repeatedly, wondering if she should have pushed harder, called more often, shown up unannounced. She acknowledged that responsibility belonged to the adults who inflicted harm, not to siblings who were kept at a distance, but she did not hide her grief or her regret. The judge imposed consecutive sentences that ensured both Thomas and Rebecca would spend the majority of their remaining lives incarcerated. There would be no possibility of early release for many years. The legal chapter closed with formal finality, but emotional closure proved far more complex. Outside the courthouse, the prosecutor addressed reporters. He described the outcome as accountability, though he stopped short of calling it justice. He noted that no sentence could restore what had been lost. He also referenced systemic questions raised by the case. Reports from school staff had documented visible warning signs. Child Protective Services had screened concerns but had not completed a timely in-home assessment. The shift to online schooling had reduced external oversight at a critical moment. In response, the county initiated internal reviews. Procedures around educational withdrawal and homeschooling notifications were reevaluated. Discussions began about tightening follow-up requirements when children with prior reports are removed from in-person instruction. Additional training was implemented for intake workers to reassess risk when multiple indicators converge: weight loss, bruising, chronic absence, and isolation. Policy changes do not move as quickly as grief. For Ava's family, life reorganized itself around absence. Her bedroom at Lauren's house, once kept ready for sleepovers, became a quiet space filled with framed photographs. Kaylee organized a scholarship fund in Ava's name for students interested in film and storytelling, reflecting the passion Ava once expressed in her essays. The first recipient wrote a thank you letter describing plans to attend film school. Lauren said reading that letter felt like hearing a faint echo of her sister's voice. Their mother remained in long-term care, her health fragile. Staff arranged a small private memorial service at the facility so she could participate in a way that did not jeopardize her condition. Photographs of Ava were placed around the room, one in her maroon graduation gown, another laughing with whipped cream on her face, another standing beneath carnival lights at the county fair. The service was brief and quiet. There were no reporters, no public statements, only family. The broader community continued to grapple with the case as a cautionary narrative. Advocacy groups cited it when pushing for stronger oversight mechanisms in child welfare systems. Educators spoke openly about the emotional toll of suspecting harm but lacking authority to intervene decisively. Some residents argued for legislative reform, others focused on volunteer efforts, mentoring programs, and neighborhood engagement designed to reduce isolation. Over time, media coverage faded. Another headline replaced the last. The house eventually was sold. A new family moved in, repainting walls, replacing fixtures, planting shrubs along the driveway. The physical setting changed, but for those who knew Ava's story, the address remained etched in memory. What endured most vividly were not the court transcripts or forensic exhibits, but the ordinary details. The way Ava once insisted on wearing bright blue sneakers with formal clothes, the way she leaned forward when a movie scene caught her attention, the way she believed that fireworks bursting over the fairgrounds were a personal celebration. Those details resisted the narrative of victimhood. They insisted on her identity as a child with preferences, humor, and imagination. The case left behind layered lessons. On an individual level, it reaffirmed that prior history matters. Rebecca's earlier involvement in child endangerment had not legally barred her from forming a new household, but it raised questions about how past conduct should inform risk assessment in blended families. On a systemic level, it exposed gaps in coordination between schools, child protective services, and courts. A single report might not trigger immediate action, but when multiple concerns accumulate across months, thresholds must adjust accordingly. For Ava's sisters, remembrance became an act of resistance against reduction. They resisted allowing her name to be associated solely with courtroom language. They shared stories publicly when they felt strong enough, not to relive trauma, but to reassert who she had been before the final year narrowed her world. On what would have been her 13th birthday, they gathered at the county fair. As dusk settled, they stood together near the edge of the midway. When the fireworks began, Lauren closed her eyes for a moment. Kaylee reached for her. Neither spoke. The colors rose and fell above them, brief and brilliant. In the end, the legal system delivered accountability measured in years of incarceration. The community implemented reforms measured in policy revisions. The family measured time in anniversaries and quiet moments. Ava's story, however, remains measured in something more enduring: the obligation to notice, to respond and to protect when vulnerability is visible. That is where the final part rests, not on the spectacle of prosecution, but on the enduring responsibility carried forward by those who remain. Eliza Novak was a bright and cheerful 10-year-old girl from the quiet town of Redbridge in England. Born on February 3, 2014, to parents Omar Novak and Magdalena Kowalski, she carried a blend of Polish and Pakistani heritage. Her early years were filled with laughter, school recitals, and afternoons spent at the park. But her family life was far from peaceful. Omar and Magdalena's marriage had fractured early, and after their separation, custody arrangements shifted in unexpected ways. Following the divorce, custody of Eliza and her two older siblings fell to Omar, a man who quickly remarried. His new wife, Nadia Farouk, moved into the family's modest council house in East Redbridge, accompanied by her brother, Kamran Farouk. From the outside, the home appeared ordinary: windows framed with lace curtains, a small garden with a scraggly hedge. But inside, a darker world unfolded, hidden from neighbors and friends. For months, whispers of tension and strange occurrences circulated among neighbors. They noted that the children rarely played outside, that Eliza seemed withdrawn, and that unexplained bruises occasionally appeared on her arms. Teachers had raised concerns when Eliza repeatedly showed up to school looking fatigued, her clothing ill-fitting, and her small frame unusually thin. Yet these reports were never fully investigated. The system had gaps, and Eliza's suffering remained largely invisible to those who might have intervened. Then, on the evening of September 15, 2024, everything changed. Omar Novak called emergency services from the Redbridge area, reporting that he had killed his daughter. In a calm yet chilling voice, he admitted to the operator that Eliza was naughty and that in disciplining her he had gone too far. He claimed he had not intended to end her life. What followed revealed a level of premeditation and callousness that stunned investigators. That same night, Omar, Nadia, and Kamran fled the UK, boarding a flight to Lahore, Pakistan. Nadia orchestrated the travel arrangements, ensuring the family vanished before authorities could respond. The next morning, police in Redbridge arrived at the Novak residence. Inside, they found Eliza's small body tucked into her bunk bed, hidden beneath a blanket. A note lay beside her, written in a shaky hand: "Love you, Eliza." The words, meant to convey affection, clashed violently with the reality her body told. The autopsy painted a grim and horrifying picture. Eliza had suffered more than 70 distinct injuries. There were human bite marks, scalds on her feet, burns inflicted with a hot iron, a fractured hyoid bone, and puncture wounds to her head. Her spine bore 11 fractures, and multiple injuries were documented on her fingers, shoulder blades, and ribs. Forensic investigators determined that the injuries indicated prolonged restraint and repeated torture over months, if not years. Further investigation revealed the specifics of the abuse. Eliza had been restrained with a hood placed over her head, beaten with a metal rod broken off a high chair, and struck repeatedly with a cricket bat. Although Omar initially claimed these assaults occurred as a form of discipline, his statements shifted over time. At first, he admitted multiple instances of abuse. Later, he recanted, suggesting only one episode of violence had occurred. During sentencing, Judge Jonathan Carlisle noted the discrepancy and emphasized that even a single act of such calculated brutality could not be dismissed as an impulsive mistake. The court also scrutinized the role of Nadia Farouk and Kamran Farouk. Bite marks on Eliza's body suggested adult involvement, with 6 distinct impressions, 5 on her arm and 1 on her inner thigh. Teeth impressions from Omar and Kamran were excluded, while Nadia refused to submit her own. The prosecution argued that the refusal implied responsibility, and the judge later agreed. The evidence portrayed a household where abuse was not only perpetrated but tolerated. Neighbors provided chilling testimony about the family's home life. Several recalled seeing Eliza confined to her room for hours, crying quietly while Omar and Nadia went about their routines. Others mentioned hearing raised voices, objects being thrown, and occasional loud thuds from the child's bedroom. Despite these warning signs, intervention had been limited, and no social worker had made unannounced home visits in the critical months leading up to Eliza's death. Omar and his family were eventually tracked to Lahore, where Pakistani authorities detained them pending extradition to the UK. On September 16, 2024, the Novak children who had survived were recovered from the home and placed into protective care. Police emphasized that thanks to the swift actions of their counterparts overseas, the remaining children were unharmed but traumatized. The legal proceedings began swiftly once the family returned to the UK. On September 18th, all 3 adults, Omar Novak, Nadia Farouk, and Kamran Farouk, were formally charged. Omar and Nadia faced murder charges, while Kamran was charged with causing or allowing the death of a child. In interviews with law enforcement, Omar attempted to shift blame to Nadia, portraying himself as a father whose frustration had tragically escalated. Nadia, on the other hand, remained silent, responding with no comment to all questions about her stepdaughter. Kamran also declined to speak. The silence of Nadia Farouk became a point of discussion in media coverage. Some speculated that she was following legal counsel's advice, while others suggested that her refusal to speak hinted at deeper culpability. For observers, it was particularly shocking that she could not affirm any care or affection for Eliza, even under questioning. The gap between stated love in notes and evident cruelty underscored the horrific reality of the household. During the months leading up to the trial, investigators meticulously compiled evidence. Forensic reports documented each injury in detail, highlighting patterns of restraint, escalation, and intentional harm. Digital communications between Omar and Nadia revealed exchanges where punishment strategies were discussed and the children's behaviors minimized or mocked. Witness statements, medical records, and previous police reports painted a consistent narrative. Eliza had endured sustained and systemic abuse. When the trial finally opened, the prosecution emphasized both the scale and the deliberateness of the abuse. They described the use of tools, the confinement, and the repeated physical assaults. They detailed the bite marks, arguing that the adult-size impressions, combined with refusal to submit evidence, implicated Nadia in the abuse. They portrayed Kamran as a bystander who failed to protect his niece despite having knowledge of ongoing harm. For the defense, the strategy focused on minimizing responsibility, suggesting that any injuries were accidents or that blame could not be clearly assigned. Outside the courtroom, the community reacted with shock and sorrow. Redbridge residents expressed frustration at the systemic failures that allowed Eliza to suffer in silence. Advocates for child protection noted that while there were multiple opportunities to intervene, fragmented communication between schools, social services, and law enforcement allowed the abuse to escalate unchecked. For Eliza's remaining family, the trial was emotionally grueling.
Her mother, Magdalena, sat through proceedings, struggling to reconcile the smiling child in photographs with the victim described in reports. Her older siblings grappled with guilt, confusion, and grief, questioning what more they could have done, even as they understood that the responsibility lay squarely with the adults in the household. As the trial moved forward, the evidence painted an unflinching portrait of cruelty and neglect. The meticulous records of injuries, corroborated by forensic experts, left little room for doubt about the severity and intent of the abuse. The narrative of a child disciplined too harshly collapsed under the weight of forensic and testimonial evidence, leaving a stark reality. Eliza's life had been cut short by deliberate, repeated acts of violence from those entrusted to care for her. The trial of Omar Novak, Nadia Farouk, and Cameron Farouk began in earnest at Redbridge Crown Court on March 3, 2025. The case had captured national attention. Newspapers ran headlines describing the horror of Eliza's death, while social media debates erupted over how such cruelty could go unnoticed for so long. For the family, the courtroom became a place where grief and anger collided with cold, methodical legal procedure. From the outset, the prosecution painted a stark picture. Detective Chief Inspector Lucas Ward, who had led the investigation, took the stand to outline the timeline and severity of the abuse. Eliza Novak was subjected to sustained and systematic violence, he stated. Her injuries indicate repeated restraint, physical punishment, and calculated harm. This was not a moment of lost temper. This was deliberate. The court heard detailed descriptions of the injuries: scalds on the soles of her feet, burns inflicted with a hot iron, fractures to her spine, and puncture wounds to her head. Even experts could not determine which of the many injuries had directly caused her death, a testament to the prolonged torture she endured. Central to the prosecution's case were the bite marks on Eliza's body. Forensic odontologists had confirmed that 5 bites on her left arm and 1 on her inner thigh had been inflicted by an adult. Teeth impressions from Omar and Cameron excluded both men. Nadia Farouk, however, refused to provide a sample, leaving the court to infer her responsibility. The judge, Jonathan Carlisle, remarked during proceedings, "While the bite marks were not fatal in themselves, they illustrate a willingness to participate in extreme acts of abuse. It demonstrates complicity and intent." Witness testimony reinforced the grim narrative. Neighbors described hearing strange noises from the Novak home: thuds, muffled cries, and the sound of doors being slammed. Several neighbors reported seeing Eliza confined to her room, often alone for hours, while her stepmother and uncle moved freely through the house. Teachers corroborated this testimony, recalling that Eliza often arrived at school exhausted, withdrawn, and occasionally bearing bruises. School nurses had noted her injuries, but lacked sufficient evidence to trigger a formal investigation. The court also heard from the surviving Novak children, who provided restrained but harrowing accounts. They spoke of their sister being tied to furniture, of bags placed over her head, and of repeated beatings with household objects like rods and cricket bats. Their testimony painted a picture of a home dominated by fear and control, where even minor infractions triggered severe punishment. Omar Novak took the stand early in the trial. Attempting to present himself as a father whose discipline had gone tragically too far, he admitted to hitting Eliza with a rod and a cricket bat on multiple occasions. Yet he attempted to minimize the frequency and severity of the abuse. At first, he suggested multiple incidents, only to later claim a single act of violence in a moment of anger. Judge Carlisle highlighted the implausibility of Omar's changing statements, noting even one instance of this calculated brutality cannot be construed as simple parental discipline. Nadia Farouk maintained a chilling silence.
During questioning, she repeatedly replied no comment when asked about her involvement or whether she had cared for Eliza. For many observers, this refusal to speak conveyed more than words could, a denial of responsibility and a lack of empathy for the child she was meant to protect. Cameron Farouk, the uncle, also chose not to testify. His role, prosecutors argued, was that of a bystander who allowed the abuse to occur, complicit through inaction. Forensic experts provided key testimony regarding the tools and methods used in Eliza's abuse. Specialists described the rods and cricket bats as instruments of sustained punishment, noting the pattern and placement of injuries. Scald marks on the feet suggested deliberate application of hot water, while burns from a heated iron indicated premeditation rather than accidental contact. Spinal fractures and head injuries pointed to forceful and repeated impacts. Each expert stressed the cumulative effect of these injuries, which demonstrated a sustained campaign of cruelty rather than an isolated incident. The prosecution also presented digital evidence, including messages exchanged between Omar and Nadia before the family fled to Pakistan. In these messages, the adults discussed disciplinary measures, expressing frustration at the children's behavior and, disturbingly, referencing methods that could inflict pain. While some messages were vague, the pattern suggested a household environment in which abuse was normalized. Investigators argued this evidence reinforced the view that Nadia was actively complicit. One of the most heart-wrenching parts of the trial came during testimony from Eliza's mother, Magdalena Kowalski. She described her reaction to seeing her daughter's body after it was recovered. She said, "I had to identify her, her voice breaking. She was covered in bruises. Her face was swollen. I couldn't believe it was Eliza. No mother should have to see her child like that." Her testimony underscored the human cost of systemic failure and deliberate cruelty, bringing into sharp focus the stakes of the trial. Throughout the proceedings, the defense attempted to portray the abuse as the result of parental frustration and isolated incidents rather than systematic harm. Omar's legal team argued that Nadia and Cameron had no direct role in Eliza's death. However, the prosecution's evidence, from forensic reports to witness testimony, consistently contradicted this narrative. The court noted the repeated and coordinated nature of the abuse, the presence of tools designed to inflict harm, and the deliberate concealment of injuries. Public interest in the case remained high. Media outlets covered each day of the trial extensively, often focusing on the shocking details of Eliza's injuries and the apparent indifference of her abusers. Community members expressed outrage that no earlier intervention had occurred, highlighting gaps in child protection protocols. Social media platforms hosted debates about whether the UK's legal and social systems had failed Eliza and what reforms might prevent similar tragedies in the future. Meanwhile, the surviving Novak children were placed under protective supervision, with counseling and trauma support provided to help them cope with the loss of their sister and the betrayal of trust they had experienced. Social workers emphasized the importance of long-term psychological support, acknowledging that the emotional scars from witnessing such violence could last well into adulthood. As the trial progressed, the jury was presented with a detailed timeline of the abuse, including the events leading up to Eliza's death and the immediate aftermath. Police reports documented Omar's call to emergency services, in which he confessed to killing his daughter, and the subsequent flight to Pakistan. Investigators highlighted the role of Nadia in facilitating the family's escape, arguing that her actions demonstrated awareness of guilt and an intent to evade justice. In one particularly striking moment, the court was shown a photograph of the note left beside Eliza's body. The simple words, "Love you, Eliza," were meant to convey affection, yet the context rendered them sinister. Judge Carlisle later remarked, "These words cannot mask the reality of what occurred. They are a hollow gesture in the face of overwhelming evidence of violence and neglect." The case against Omar and Nadia had been established with compelling evidence, while Cameron's role as a passive participant remained clear. The trial revealed not only the horrifying details of Eliza's abuse, but also the systemic vulnerabilities that allowed her suffering to go undetected. It highlighted the meticulous work of investigators, the courage of witnesses, and the painstaking accumulation of evidence required to bring perpetrators to justice. The next part will follow the verdicts, sentencing, and the aftermath of the trial, including the public reaction, prison incidents, and ongoing legal developments. It will examine the ripple effects on the family, the local community, and child protection services, concluding with the broader lessons learned from this tragic case. On April 28, 2025, after nearly 2 months of testimony, the jury in Red Bridge Crown Court reached its verdict. The tension in the courtroom was palpable as the foreperson rose to deliver the decision. Omar Novak and Nadia Farouk were both found guilty of murder. Kamran Farouk, the uncle, was acquitted of murder but convicted on the charge of causing or allowing the death of a child. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the courtroom as the weight of the verdicts settled over the family and those present. Detective Chief Inspector Lucas Ward addressed the press shortly after the verdict. Eliza Novak was a bright, lively, and curious 10-year-old who had her entire life ahead of her, he said. Her death was the result of prolonged and systematic abuse at the hands of those who should have protected her. Today's verdict ensures that justice has been served, but it cannot undo the suffering she endured. Ward's statement highlighted the painstaking work that had gone into building a case against 3 adults who, through action or inaction, contributed to her tragic death. Omar Novak's conduct in the courtroom drew particular attention. Though he had initially attempted to minimize his role, the evidence was overwhelming. Multiple injuries, repeated beatings, and the careful concealment of abuse left no room for doubt. Even the jury, after reviewing autopsy reports, photographs, and forensic testimony, had no choice but to convict him. Nadia Farouk's silence during questioning and refusal to submit a dental sample to identify bite marks further reinforced her complicity. Kamran Farouk, though not directly violent, had failed to intervene despite being aware of the abuse, which the court determined made him culpable. The courtroom also heard about Omar's initial flight to Pakistan with his family after Eliza's death. Nadia had coordinated the escape, arranging travel for the family to avoid detection by British authorities. The prosecution argued that this act of evasion demonstrated consciousness of guilt. Police located the family in Islamabad shortly after the murder and facilitated their return to the UK for trial. This cross-border cooperation was essential in holding the perpetrators accountable and illustrated the complexities of international law in cases of child abuse. Sentencing occurred on May 15, 2025. Justice Jonathan Carlisle delivered a stern judgment. Omar Novak was sentenced to a minimum of 40 years in prison, reflecting the extreme cruelty, premeditation, and sustained nature of the abuse. Nadia Farouk received 33 years, and Kamran Farouk was sentenced to 16 years for his failure to prevent the child's death. Justice Carlisle emphasized the moral responsibility of adults entrusted with a child's welfare. No measure of remorse can mitigate the severity of these acts, he said. The sentences reflect both the magnitude of the crime and society's obligation to protect its most vulnerable members. The public reaction to the verdict and sentencing was intense. Media outlets highlighted the shocking details of Eliza's abuse, drawing attention to failures in oversight and child protection systems.
Social media debates ranged from outrage over the cruelty inflicted to discussions about how such cases could be prevented in the future. Community members expressed relief that justice had been served, but also sorrow over the tragic loss of a young life. Within the prison system, Omar Novak faced immediate consequences. On New Year's Day 2026, reports surfaced that he had been attacked in his cell at Belmarsh Prison, one of the UK's most secure facilities. Two inmates had assaulted him using a jagged piece of a tin can, inflicting cuts to his face and neck. He was treated in the prison medical unit, but the attack left him terrified of returning to the general population. Sources within the prison suggested Omar's notoriety, combined with the brutal nature of his crime, made him a target for other inmates seeking their own form of justice. Belmarsh Prison, located in southeast London, houses some of the country's most dangerous offenders, including convicted murderers and terrorism suspects. The prison has a reputation for violence, with inmates often targeting those convicted of crimes against children. Omar's attack highlighted the ongoing challenges of maintaining safety in high-security facilities while balancing the legal rights of all prisoners. While segregation was considered for his protection, it was noted that indefinite separation was not feasible under UK prison regulations, meaning he would eventually face the general population again. The case also prompted wider discussions about child welfare and the historical decisions that allowed Omar Novak custody of Eliza and her siblings. Media investigations revealed that during previous family court hearings, the judge had been aware of Omar's violent history and multiple prior arrests, yet custody was still granted. A subsequent appeal challenged the anonymity previously granted to the judges, arguing that transparency was necessary given public interest in a case of this magnitude. On January 31, 2026, the Court of Appeals ruled that the judges involved in the original custody decision must be publicly named: Alison Rayfield, Peter Dempsey, and Sally Whitaker. Rayfield remained active, while Dempsey and Whitaker had retired. For Eliza's surviving siblings, the aftermath of the trial was complex and emotionally taxing. Placed in protective foster care, they received therapy and counseling to help process the trauma. Social workers emphasize the importance of long-term emotional support, recognizing that witnessing such violence can have enduring psychological effects. The community rallied around the children, offering both emotional and practical assistance to help them rebuild their lives in a safer environment. Legal experts noted that the case highlighted systemic gaps in child protection. School officials, neighbors, and healthcare providers had observed signs of abuse, yet earlier intervention had failed. The prosecution argued that more robust monitoring and reporting mechanisms could prevent similar tragedies in the future. In particular, attention was drawn to communication between social services, education authorities, and law enforcement to ensure timely responses when children display signs of repeated injury or neglect. In the months following sentencing, the story continued to dominate national headlines. Appeals were filed by both Omar Novak and Nadia Farouk, seeking to reduce their sentences. Meanwhile, the Solicitor General, Lucy Rigby, filed a separate appeal, arguing that Omar's 40-year minimum term was insufficient given the brutality of the crime. These legal maneuvers underscored the ongoing scrutiny of the case and demonstrated that high-profile crimes often remain subject to procedural developments long after the initial verdict. The public remained deeply engaged, and advocacy groups used the case to campaign for stronger child protection laws. Workshops, policy discussions, and public awareness campaigns highlighted the importance of recognizing early warning signs of abuse and empowering educators, neighbors, and family members to act. Psychologists emphasize the critical role of education and community vigilance in preventing similar tragedies. For law enforcement, the investigation and trial of Omar Novak and his accomplices served as a benchmark for future child protection cases.
Detective Ward and his team were praised for their meticulous work, particularly in reconstructing the timeline, gathering forensic evidence, and coordinating with international authorities. The case reinforced the necessity of thorough documentation and cross-border cooperation in bringing perpetrators to justice. Ultimately, the story of Eliza Novak remains a somber reminder of the consequences of unchecked abuse and the responsibility of adults entrusted with a child's care. While her life was tragically cut short, the successful prosecution of her abusers ensured that they could no longer harm others. The case also prompted societal reflection, legal reforms, and ongoing support for her surviving siblings. In Redbridge and beyond, Eliza's memory endures, not just as a victim, but as a symbol of resilience. Her story continues to inspire vigilance in communities, fostering awareness of child welfare and the urgent need to protect vulnerable children from harm. As legal proceedings and appeals continue, the broader lessons of accountability, justice, and child protection remain central to public discourse, ensuring that Eliza's tragic death contributes to meaningful societal change.